So we've done it. We've done it. It's that time. We're ready for the final render. We got there. Thank you so much for making it through this whole series. Hopefully it was helpful. Again, any questions, reach out. I'll try to help. But if you've made it to this point, thank you so much. This is crazy. So if you've been following along this whole time, we have our object, we have our set, and you'll notice that I've tweaked some things a little bit more. I changed some lighting around, and I'm just gonna run through that really quick, what I ended up doing, because I didn't wanna make you sit there and just watch me move a white card to the left, move a white card to the right, move it up, move it down for 2 hours, which is the way that these things usually work for me. So I'm just going to run through what I ended up doing to get it to look like this, if you want it to look exactly like this. So our area light I ended up putting up here. It's a little bit bigger. The power for that light is 2,000. Our spotlight still at 10,000. And it's really feathered off the front here. It's really feathered off the front. I have the blend down. You'll see all these settings right here if you want to mimic these settings. I have the blend down really far. Radius is 0.75. And yeah, it's just off the front there. And one of the big changes, I made the card underneath black, and then this white card, I decided to bend it up even more. You could do a loop cut there and drag the bottom out, or honestly, you could just make a second separate white card. I also added another white card or just a white plane right here to try to fill in this gold to just get it to look nice. That's where we are if you want to take a stab at getting it to look exactly the way that this looks. I think I made the product a little bit smaller too. That's where we are, and that's what we're working with. So now we're ready for the final render. So you'll see on the right here, we have output properties and we also have render properties. So in the output properties, which looks like a printer, I suppose, one of the things I'm going to change is this output down here. The default is PNG, which I am personally not a fan of. So I'm going to change that to TIFF. And I know there are some different options and there are different options for less loss, but trying to get this to feel like a photo, I use TIFF. I also changed to RGB. Don't know how much of a difference that makes. I also changed the compression from deflate to none. Don't want that compression. Output location will end up saving it anyway, so that doesn't completely matter. Then we have a resolution, which right now is 1080 by 1080. So sometimes I just want to see what's going on. I want to get a preview of what it's going to look like in the render. You get your rendered view, which is a small preview, but sometimes you want an incrementally larger preview to see how the detail is looking, because you can't always completely tell what the detail is going to come out like until you start to get into some renders, even if they're on the lower quality end. So for that, I'll do a 1080 by 1080 and see what's going on. For a final render, when I know like this is really looking the way that I want it to look, I like those to be between 3,500 and 5,000. And part of the reasoning for that, even if it's something that I'm posting on Instagram, and I know that on Instagram it's just going to be 1,500 by 1,500 or 1,000 by 1,000, whatever you think is appropriate for Instagram. Part of my reasoning for rendering out images that large just to resize them down to being smaller is you still get a different amount of information in that larger render. So just like when you're shooting with a real camera, there's more information, and then Photoshop or Capture One or Lightroom, whatever you're using, is reinterpreting whatever data it needs to reinterpret to get that down to a smaller image. And that's what your eyes are used to seeing. That's what you think is photoreal. So I've tested it out. If you do a render that's 1,500 by 1,500, it looks different than a render that is 5,000 by 5,000 that then gets resized down to 1,500 by 1,500. And maybe that's a waste of time, but if we're talking about photorealism and something that could pass for real or be close enough to pass for a photo, depending on what you're doing, that's the way that I accomplish that. And I know that that's a small little detail, but I honestly think it's one of those things that adds up. And this whole process is about little tiny details, especially the rendering. It's little tiny details that all add up to something that can feel and look a certain way. This is the way that I approach getting something to feel more real. So for the sake of this render, I'm going to do 3,500 by 3,500. For me, that's kind of my minimum for something that's going to look remotely real. And so we've got TIFF, RGB, color depth 8. Then I know in an earlier video we already changed to cycles. That's super important, so I just want to reiterate that. Cycles, very important. So then we get into a super, super important area. Blender 3.0 by default has these noise threshold things set up, which is a new thing for Blender 3.0. I am not a huge fan. So what we're going to do here is we're going to uncheck noise threshold for the viewport, and we're going to uncheck noise threshold for the render. We're also going to uncheck the denoise. That's right under these two settings. So for viewport samples, usually I like 32, which is the old setting from the previous version of Blender. And then the old default setting for the number of samples for the render is 150. So I'm going to start out there. Turn off denoise. Another one of my pillars of photorealism is the denoise just makes it look smooth and weird. And it makes it look CG. To me, it is not helpful for making something look real, especially for one single image that people get to just really focus on individually. If it's something that's moving, if it's something that's ending up as a video, then I think the denoise can be helpful. There's also the open image denoise. Like there's different ways to denoise within Blender. So there are ways you can finesse those that can look okay. But in general, the denoise makes it look more fake. Also, when you take a photo with a real camera, with a digital camera, there is some amount of noise. When you take a photo with a film camera, there is some amount of grains. So again, these are things that our eyes are used to seeing, our minds are used to interpreting, and it just gives it a little bit of that feeling of reality, because in real life, you're not going to take a picture with a digital camera and have no noise. And sometimes that noise is integrated in with the color, so it's like there's color and noise. And I think a big thing is the subtlety. A subtle amount of noise and the way that that noise is interacting with the color can also create dimension. So that's one of my gripes with the denoise, is it has a tendency to lose a lot of that subtlety. Even though open image denoise is supposed to have AI that can determine what's supposed to be denoised and what's not supposed to be denoised, it just feels more real with some of the noise in there. So the way that this works in cycles, it's cycling through different parts of this image. So 150 cycles means that each little chunk of this image is getting cycled through and processed 150 times, which sounds like a lot, but depending on your computer, it can do that really fast actually. So you can change this number. The higher the number of cycles, the less grain you will get in your image. So you could do something like 500. I guess you could go up even higher than that, but for me, I'm usually between like 150 and 500. And this number also has a relationship to the number back in the output properties of the resolution. So the bigger your resolution is, to an extent, you don't need to have as many cycles, because the fact that it's bigger makes cycles spend more time on these smaller parts of the image. You're taking what one chunk would be and shrinking that down so it's making up the whole image, and then overall it's having more resolution as well. So if you're making your image a higher resolution, you don't necessarily need to have as many samples. You could do both and do a higher resolution and a high number of samples. But again, I tell you, sometimes higher samples, higher resolution makes it look fake. So it's up to you, it's up to the image, it's up to the way the light is set up, because if there's more light bouncing around and more things for the light to do, especially if there's transparency, if there's light passing through things, that will all be something that can kind of tend to come out a little more grainy, and then that's where you would need more samples if you want those areas to come out more smooth. But for me, some amount of grain is what helps make this look real. That being said, I think I'm going to go ahead and give this a shot. So we've got 3500 by 3500 here in our output properties. We've got cycles turned on. We've got this noise threshold thing turned off. So actually for the final render, like this viewport thing is not relevant, but it just is a thing. Then for our render, we're at 150 samples. Our denoise is off. So this should be set to GPU because I have a GPU. Talked about that earlier, but if you have a GPU, set it to GPU. If you don't have a graphics card, GPU will not be there, and it'll just be CPU. But this can work on CPU, especially for a still image. You know, we'll see how long it takes for your computer, but a still image is probably not going to be that bad. Also, one thing to note is this image is being rendered from our active camera. So if you only have one camera, that one camera is the active camera. And if you're not sure, or if you're in a situation where there are multiple cameras, which within the context of this video, I have not explained how to do that, but have your camera selected over there in the collection, or you can select it in the viewport. View, cameras, set active object as camera. And again, that's only if you have multiple cameras, which within this tutorial, you should not have multiple cameras. But it's rendering from the view of this camera. Usually I have render regions selected over here, just so you know exactly what it's going to look like and it doesn't distract you and kind of take the computer longer to do an approximation of other things that are not going to be in the shot. So we are ready to render. You made it. Let's go. So up here, I'm going to click on render and render image, which is also F12. Click it, and then sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. So you'll get some numbers up here. You'll get this number that says remaining, and that is, as you might have guessed, the remaining time. And this first time, that is the time that has elapsed. You can kind of drag this thing around if you want. I would suggest, depends on your computer, but don't do other things while this is rendering because it'll make the render take longer. It'll also slow down whatever else you're doing, especially things that are video related. So don't start this render and then try to edit a video on the same computer. I would say just walk away and let it do its thing. So yeah, this is estimating at about 17 minutes, which is not bad. Depending on your computer, depending on the size, it'll show you different previews. You can still do the zoom and pan. So I'm going to cut this to when the render finishes, and I will check back with you then. So now we've got our rendered image. Took apparently 14, almost 15 minutes. So you'll know it's done when you lose the multiple times and the times aren't changing anymore. It just says one time that's not changing, and you don't have little dots that are moving around over here. So this is done. And what you want to do now is in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see view and image. You want to click image and you want to click save as. So this will be familiar. This is where you save an image. So these settings over here are the same settings that we had in our output before. So you don't have to change those if those are correct. And name your image. I'm going to call this one Final Render. And obviously remember where you put it and just click Save as Image. Boom, now you're done. So there's this render window. I'm going to close that out and then I'm going to go to the Finder and find where that image went. So that image is here. Now we're going to get into a very, very, very important step and something that I interestingly have not seen being discussed on the internet. So in the information, I guess you could right click on it and go to the information if you're not on a Mac, but on a Mac, in the information, you can kind of like scroll down here and you can see the color space is RGB. For whatever reason, Blender exports these images without a color profile. So I'm going to open this up in Photoshop. I'm going to just drag it into Photoshop. And you may notice that it looks a bit different. Color-wise, it looks a bit different. It's like a little bit gray. It's a little bit gray is one issue. It's a little bit gray, like the color is a little bit dead. So somewhat of a head scratcher, but I realized if you go to Edit and Assign Profile, not Convert to Profile, but Assign Profile, how it's set right now is that the document is not color managed. So I click on Profile and assign this color profile of Adobe RGB, which is where I personally like to work with color. And so you can see this little preview tab. If I turn the preview off, that's our weird gray image, and that's with it. So I'm not sure how or why Blender exports images without the color profile that you're working in, because in Blender, the colors are like looking the way they're supposed to look. Then you save the render and it just doesn't quite look right. And I know, in video, you're like, oh, just saturate this and move this thing and that thing, but it's like you're starting from the wrong point already. Like we made decisions about the color in Blender. So to be starting off on the wrong foot is just wrong already. So this is a super, super huge thing where things do not look right if you don't do this first. So assign profile, I do Adobe RGB, click OK. So now I'll do a Command S and save. Now we're in a Photoshop tutorial, but at this point what you would do, so I would import this into Capture One and apply my settings to it, my color, contrast. The same thing that I would do to an image that had been taken with a camera in real life, I would then do to this image. So I would import it into Capture One and do stuff with it. You could also do that in Lightroom. However you would make an image look cool, that's what you would do with this image. Visco. So for this tutorial, I'm just going to do some things in Photoshop because basically all I'm doing in Capture One is adjusting the contrast. So I thought I would just show it in Photoshop since that's a much more common thing for someone to have. So I'm just going to go to New Adjustment Layer down here. I'm going to go to Levels. And then I'm going to move the white, whatever that is, the white limit over here. And I'm going to move the black limit over here. So I think that was too far on the white, so I'll just leave the white right there. Then I will also go and add a curves layer that same way. Or little adjustments, yeah, new adjustment layer down here. Then curves. And then I would just give that a little more contrast. So this is our before, and this is it with the contrast. So the image that gets rendered, I treat it as like our flat, it's not a raw file, but I treat it the way that you would treat a raw file in a photographer type of situation. So it is usually going to be a bit flat, which is not bad. It's a good way to retain highlight and shadow dimension if it's a bit flatter. It just needs some contrast. And that contrast really makes it pop out and stand out. And then you can zoom in. So here we're at 100%, and you can see the grain is not bad. You can see it a little bit, but the grain is not bad. Like there's some back here, but again, that makes it feel tangible. Like you could almost reach out and touch it like it's something that really exists. That's how it would be in a real camera. I'm actually going to give it a little bit even more contrast. Really spice it up. Yes, I'm going to do Command S, save again. I do byte order Macintosh. I don't know that it really matters. And then there we are. Now you have your first final rendered image. So if you're still interested, I have one more little thing that makes this image look cool if you want to stick along for that. And we're going to add some glare to this. Now the glare, it's very easy to go wrong. It's very easy to make it look CG and wild. And the way that this works, it is essentially just a filter over top of what we have already rendered. So it's not a real like light bouncing into the lens calculation. It's more of applying a filter afterwards. But I think that it can help, and I think for this image, I think that it looks cool. Some images it's going to look wild, but I think for the gold, I think it'll look cool on this image. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the compositing workspace, this tab up here. For me, it's in the middle. This compositing workspace, and then you get just this big black void. So in the upper left, there's this checkbox for use nodes. We're going to check that. Use nodes. So now you have your rendered layers that pops up here. You have your composite node right here. We're going to go to add, and we're going to go to output. We are adding a viewer. Bam. We are also adding, so click add one more time, filter, and we are adding a glare down here. So we're going to put that in the middle. We're going to, you don't have to disconnect the actual composite. It depends on how you're working, but you don't have to do that. You can drag the yellow dot from image in the rendered layers over to the image down here. Then, you guessed it, drag the image from the glare over to the viewer. Then, in a couple seconds, you'll get this. And you can already see, at least for me, you can see that glare popped up right there. And then one way that I like to work, you can make a new window. Now you're a real pro here when you're making new windows. You can make a new window. You have to go down into the corner and you'll get a plus sign. Click and drag over. That'll make a new window. So in this new window that you hopefully successfully made, because it is sort of confusing and the worst, there's this little stack icon with a drop-down arrow. So, editor type. So we're going to click on that, and within that we have image editor pretty close to the top on the left here, second from the top. So we're going to click on that. Now, again, we have nothing. So this little mountain icon over here in the same window, we're going to click that drop down, and there's something called viewer node. Now that viewer node relates to this viewer node. So over here, you can pan around, as you're familiar with by now, and you can zoom out. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to scroll back. And as you can see, our glare is in there now. And then you can control, so I'm going to zoom back in just to kind of see what's happening. So this is it with our glare being composited together, and you can control these settings. So this one right now is streaks. You can choose fog glow, and it'll take a second. You can see down here, it's gone. You can do fog glow, so it's a little more subtle. But there's simple star, which looks like nothing apparently. And then you can change this threshold. So this threshold is, I guess what it says there, they will only be applied to pixels brighter than this value. So you can scroll around and see what that looks like. Like if you go really low, it'll start to kind of glare out and look like a weird kind of like grease on the lens. Yeah, grease on the lens, hazy, like 80s type of thing. So if that's what you're going for, I think something like an 8 is kind of cool. And you can see how this could get wild when it's overdone. But so you've done that, you get it to a point where your glare's looking nice, you're feeling confident about it. So up here, because you've already rendered, this only works when you've already rendered an image. Also, the render only sticks around in that way while Blender is open to that same file. So if you rendered that first file, then you came back to watch this video and you want to do this part now, but you closed out Blender and opened it back up, you have to re-render that again, unfortunately, as far as I know. So if this isn't coming up, like if you connect these nodes over here and nothing comes up, especially if in rendered layers there's nothing here, that's because it doesn't have a render that's in there. So you have to render it again for whatever reason. But if you have something that's freshly rendered, all this has happened, this is working, the node thing is working. Oh, another thing is you can control, I guess, the resolution of this effect. So the lower the resolution of this effect, the bigger the glare will be. So sometimes I like to go to low. Yeah, so low is giving us even more. Actually, maybe that's too much. I'll do medium. And then that also is tied to our output resolution as well. So if you get this looking the way that you want at 1080 by 1080, then you do another render that's 3500 by 3500 or 5000 by 5000, then this glare is going to get smaller, and it's fairly annoying. So usually I end up changing it to low, because then once it's rendered at a higher resolution, then it'll end up looking that way. But however it looks in here is how it's going to look as it applies to this render. So now that you're feeling confident about this looks the way that you want it to look. In this window over to the right, you can press image, go to save as, and then it's the same situation as before. So I'll call this final render _2, save as image, and now that's it. So it's just compositing this glare onto the previous render. So if you do another render, it will automatically composite it into over here. Another thing I'll do sometimes is I'll connect this node back up to here. Yeah. So what that does is when you press render in the previous screen, the thing that pops up is going to be this composite window, which can be kind of confusing. So this just makes sure that when the next render that you do, the window that pops up will have this composited together with it. Otherwise, it would just be the regular image, but you could still come back and save it this way. I just wanted to throw that in there, which I'm sure is very confusing. And then if you wanted to not have this glare anymore, just as an FYI, just having this connected back there, the first steps will be the same, and the window that pops up will have it rendered without this glare composited on top of it. Then just to finish these steps, again, if you're not sure if you have applied the color profile to an image or not after it's been rendered, this is a good comparison. This new one that was just rendered, we can scroll down here and see color space RGB. The previous one that we did change the color profile of, or apply the color profile to, you can scroll down and it says color profile Adobe RGB. And that's what you want. It could be sRGB as well, I guess, but these ones where it's nothing, where it's just generic RGB, is not good. So I'm going to open that up in Photoshop again, just to run through this one more time. Go to Edit, Assign Profile. And then I do Adobe RGB. As you can see, boom, again, it makes it the way that it's supposed to look, and our glare is in there. Press OK, and then I'm just going to go to the previous one, select these, drag them over, and if you have multiple images, Lightroom or Capture One, any other kind of like image workflow is better than just doing it in Photoshop, but I felt like Photoshop was an accessible way to demonstrate the way that this works. So now you're ready to go out in the world and put some things together and make some interesting CG images. So you're probably wondering, how do I get more objects to put into more scenes and do other fun little stuff? And it's interesting that you would ask that, because the very next video is actually about that. So if you want to tune in for that next video, all your questions will be answered.